On This Week in Enterprise Tech, we talk about how ransomware hits again, and this time it's 10 different hospitals. Plus, Curtis takes us through firmware security and how it applies to FISMA. Plus, Brian, Curtis, and I talk with Kyle Davis from Redis Labs about cloud databases and memory caching. Twiat on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Twiat, This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 362, recorded October 4th, 2019. Redis Player 1. This episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by Things Canary. Detect attackers on your network with honeypots that can be deployed in minutes. For 10% off and a 60-day money-back guarantee, go to canary.tools/twit and enter the code TWIT in the How Do You Hear About Us box. And by Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage. Thinking about moving your data storage to the cloud? Wasabi is enterprise-class cloud storage at 1/5 the price of Amazon S3 and up to 6 times faster with no hidden fees for egress or API requests. Calculate your savings and try Wasabi with free unlimited storage for a month at wasabi.com, code ENTERPRISE. And by Worldwide Technology. Worldwide Technology's advanced technology center is like no other testing and research lab with over 150 different security services and applications, including OEMs like Cisco Umbrella, and it's virtual, so you can access it 24/7. To learn more and get insights into all that it offers, go to wwt.com/twit. Welcome to Twiat, This Week in Enterprise Tech, the show that's dedicated to you, the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and that geek who just wants to know how this world is connected. I'm your host, Louis Maresca, your guide through this big, giant world of the enterprise, but I definitely can't guide you by myself. I need some help from the professionals and some of my favorite people in this world, starting with our very own geek in paradise, Mr. Brian Chee, Director of Advanced Network Computing Laboratory in Honolulu. Cheebert, it's great to see you, my friend. What's been keeping you busy down there?
I've been doing a whole bunch of cleaning up and getting my lab packed up. In fact, I actually have a tall kitchen garbage bag, absolutely stuffed and packed solid with fiber optic connectors that are going to go to one of my ex-students over at Leeward Community College. She's going to be ramping up a fiber optic termination class for her program.
Another man's junk is another man's, what is it, treasure?
Yeah, it's about $7,000 or $8,000 worth of fiber optic connectors.
It's amazing. Now you're getting ready to head to Vegas too, right?
Yeah, WISPAPalooza. I'm in Vegas from the 12th to the 18th. So if there are any, of the Twiat Riot, I'd love to join you for an adult beverage while I'm there. I'm going to be there with my partner. We're spinning up a WISP in Honolulu.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cheebert, for being here. Well, let's go ahead and bring in another expert, our very own Mr. Curtis Franklin, Senior Editor at Dark Reading. Curtis, it's great to see you, my friend. Now, are you preparing for any more MakerCons?
Actually, beginning to get ready for Maker Faire here in Orlando. That's going to be the second weekend in November. We have been putting together our robot arena, our robot fighting arena, where we'll have the largest collection of heavyweight bots, any place that's not part of the television series. And just as we like to say, the world's largest show and tell. It's quite an amazing thing to take part in, quite an amazing thing to be part of, and probably will keep me off the streets and out of the pool halls until sometime in late November.
Fantastic. Well, speaking of amazing things, we have an amazing show for you today. We're going to talk a little bit about healthcare and how they're actually being hit by ransomware. Plus, we're going to talk about FISMA requirements related to firmware security. Plus, we have a great guest, Kyle Davis, head of developer advocacy from Redis Labs, talk a little bit about cloud storage, cloud databases, and Redis. But before we get into all of that goodness, let's go ahead and jump into this week's blips. Now, we all know Netflix is a thing and that they're actually influential around trends. And Netflix has actually been driving actually been driving a driving force on the internet, where Disney Plus, Hulu, HBO, CBS, and other streaming services actually had to jump on the bandwagon to keep up. But what you didn't know was the actual impact Netflix has made. Now, according to a new report from bandwidth management company Sandvine, Netflix is one of the world's largest bandwidth consumers on the planet at 15% of the world's bandwidth. Now, I always thought it was actually YouTube that was doing that, 15%. Now, to put this in perspective, the rest of the traffic consists of actually miscellaneous video embeds on websites, which is around 13.1%. Now, YouTube actually takes up around 11.4%, and just general web browsing is around 7.8%. Now, this means that streaming video accounts actually take up more than half of the bandwidth on the internet at 58% of all total bandwidth. Now, if this is not a hint that you'll actually see more of the incoming years of more video services, I don't know what is. But some of the other interesting facts here is that actually torrents are still alive and kicking, with BitTorrent being responsible for 22% of total upstreams on the web. Also, social media accounts are up there at 5.1%. Now, for the gamers out there, League of Legends accounts for 26% of the gaming streaming traffic on the web. Now, if you want to know what areas of the web will have the performance you're looking for when you're actually surfing or playing games, with all the optimizations at the network later, now you know. You just need to play a little bit more League of Legends and watch more Netflix.
Well, new research shows the Magecart Group 4 is linked to the Cobalt Group. Now, if you are part of a company that has a website where you take orders or accept money from customers, then you've probably heard of Magecart, which is an umbrella term for at least 7 cyber criminal groups responsible for installing skimmers onto e-commerce websites with the goal of lifting payment data. Security researchers have recently discovered a link between Magecart Group 4 and Cobalt Group, a well-known, financially motivated group in operation since 2015. Findings indicate Group 4 is not only conducting client-side skimming, but was, and likely still is, doing the same on the server side. The threat of Magecart quickly gained notoriety as groups planted skimmers on websites, including British Airways and Ticketmaster. Group 4 is considered one of the more advanced groups because its operators use sophisticated techniques to blend into normal traffic. For example, they'll register domain names seemingly connected with analytic providers or advertisers. The group also seems to have a history in banking malware, the same area of expertise as Cobalt Group, which is also known as Fin7 and Carbonac Group. Researchers looked for pieces of infrastructure used by Magecart groups, as well as connections between domain registrations and IP locations. They used indicators of compromise, domain registration, and code from TTPs, or that's tactics, techniques, and procedures, to conclude that Cobalt Group may have shifted to web skimming. As far as web skimming goes, most of the discussion revolves around client-side activity because the skimmers are available for purchase online and quite easy to customize. Attackers can track their activities, automate, and scale, and it's fairly easy to rent a skimmer kit, buy some exploits to compromise sites, and start skimming, and that explains the recent increase of newcomers in this particular space. Server-side skimming, by comparison, involves more effort to customize and maintain each skimmer for every e-commerce website targeted, but of course, each one of those has the potential for much, much more profit.
Well, this is going to make a lot of folks real happy, especially if you're collecting data out in the field. LTE-M, also called LTE-Cat M1, or long-term evolution, aka 4G, category M1. This technology is for the Internet of Things devices to connect directly to a 4G network without a gateway and on batteries. So the bottom line, it's cheaper. Devices can connect to 4G networks with chips that are less expensive to make because they are half duplex and have a much narrower bandwidth. Long battery life. Devices can go into a deep sleep mode called power savings mode or wake up periodically when connected. That mode is called extended discontinuous reception. You should read more about that, but it can dramatically reduce your power consumption. The service is less. It's a lot cheaper. Because the maximum data rate of LTE-M device is only about 100 kilobits per second, they don't put a lot of load on 4G networks. So carriers can offer service plans that are closer to the old 2G machine-to-machine pricing than the old 4G. With service plans for up to 64 kilobits per second LTE Cat M1 from folks like AT&T coming in at around $30 a year, this makes LTE connected devices like electric meters, burglar alarms, and other IoT devices a reality without requiring badly set up Wi-Fi connections by installers. This also means that folks can drop in something like an OpenGear ACM terminal server to provide a last-ditch method of bringing remote locations back from the grave without a large recurring cost. All in all, this is going to have a massive impact on enterprise adoption of IoT devices. The sad part is that LTE Cat M1 and narrowband IoT are competing standards with slightly different modem support. So while I'm really excited about LTE Cat M1, you really need to read up on the differences and make an informed decision for your application. Whichever one you choose, keep in mind that both standards seem to be looking at filling the void that 2G left behind in the United States.
Now, we think of web hosting providers. You think of cloud services that allow people to build websites and host their content on their infrastructure, right? Well, sure, there are some questionable sites out there, but when asked to take them down, most hosting providers, they normally comply, right? Well, what about those hosting companies that hide in plain sight? They actually are invisible cloaks for nefarious activity. Well, there's a name for them, and they're called bulletproof hosting providers. Now, there are those hosting providers that ignore abuse reports and allow cybercrime operations to be conducted on their servers and infrastructure. Now, some countries are actually starting to crack down on such hosting providers. Now, this past week, Dutch police took down one such bulletproof hosting provider called KV Solutions BV. Now, that masked actually tens of IoT botnets that were responsible for hundreds of thousands of DDoS attacks around the world. Now, for 2 years, the company provided hosting infrastructure to internet criminals and has been one of the most serious offenders of such things as phishing pages to vulnerability scanners, and from crypto mining operations to malware repositories. Now, the company has made a reputation in the cybersecurity circles for being a hotspot for DDoS botnets, with cyber criminals renting KV servers to host their botnet scanners, malware, and command and control servers, knowing they'd be safe from prosecution. Now, these particular botnets were created using a so-called IoT malware, which actually is a malware to design and infect Linux-based operating systems that run on routers and other smart devices. Now, these type of botnets were known to be scanning the internet for a wide range of devices, including ASUS routers, Huawei routers, JAWS web servers, Netgear routers, and more. While the vast majority of DDoS botnets operating on KV's infrastructure had been seen running a version of Mirai IoT malware, the hosting firm also harbored botnets built with all sorts of other IoT malware, encompassing almost all of the IoT malware variants seen in the past year. Now, essentially a DDoS for hire service for all the cyber criminals out there. Now, according to authorities that seized their services, if you connected to services on IP blocks of 185.244.25.0/24, you might find no responses from that range indefinitely. Now, if nothing else, this is a win for cybersecurity until the next bulletproof hosting provider pops up with their fancy new cloaking mechanism.
Well, speaking of versions, millions more embedded devices have been found to contain vulnerable IPnet software. A substantially greater number of real-time operating systems powering critical medical, industrial, and enterprise devices are affected by a set of recently discovered security vulnerabilities than were originally reported. Armis, which earlier this year disclosed as many as 11 zero-day bugs in VxWorks RTOS, an OS embedded in over 2 billion devices, this week described 5 other similar operating systems that also contain the flaws. The vulnerabilities allow attackers to remotely take control of systems and execute code of their choice on them to change their function, steal data, cause denial of service attacks, and other digital mayhem. Armis identified the 5 products newly discovered as being vulnerable as ThreatX by Microsoft, Operating System Embedded, or OSE, from Enea, Integrity by Green Hills, iTron from the Tron Forum, and Nucleus RTOS by Mentor. Also impacted is ZebOS, a routing framework from IP Infusion that many network component manufacturers use in routers, switches, and other products. Now, when Armis originally reported the so-called Urgent 11 bugs in July, the company estimated that some 200 million devices running versions of VxWorks spanning a 13-year period were open to exploit. The new discovery suggests that potentially millions of additional medical, enterprise, and industrial devices are impacted as well.
So apparently a whole bunch of really big ISPs are very unhappy with Google's plans for encrypted DNS. So when you visit a new website, your computer probably submits a request to the domain name system to translate the domain name to an IP address. Currently, most DNS queries are unencrypted, which raises privacy and security concerns. Google and Mozilla are trying to address these concerns by adding support in their browsers for sending DNS queries over the encrypted HTTPS protocol. But major internet service providers have cried foul. In a September 19th letter to Congress, big cable and other telecom industry groups warned that Google's support for DNS over HTTPS could interfere on a mass scale with critical internet functions, as well as raise data competition issues. The second concern, that Google will switch Chrome users to its own DNS servers, giving Google concentrated power over DNS. Google's response is simple. Quote, Google has no plans to centralize or change people's DNS providers to Google by default, unquote. And that was in a letter, or actually an email, back to the authors of this article at Ars Technica. They continue by saying any claim that we are trying to become the centralized encrypted DNS provider is inaccurate. So we've had a whole bunch of people on the show talking about different types of DNS. You know, we've talked a little bit about DNS Dane and things like that, where you can actually put encryption certificates into DNS entries. But my opinion is that a lot of ISPs are upset that they won't be able to sell user usage data, nor would they be able to easily redirect users to ad sites based upon your DNS query. I tend to agree with the Ars Technica author in that the migration to SSL for the vast majority of websites will have a similar impact that encrypting the DNS queries is a natural, basically when we moved to SSL, that had a big impact. And people like Let's Encrypt have made it a lot easier and cheaper for the vast majority of websites to be encrypted. Now, as a natural follow-on, encrypting the DNS queries might just be a really great idea to help protect user privacy.
So no technology is too small, no OS is too secure for zero-day exploits and vulnerabilities. Now, the latest one is on Android, and it affects 18 different phone models, including 4 different Google Pixel models. Now, Google's Project Zero research group is hot on the trail of the latest exploit and found that it's actually actively being exploited by a developer, NSO Group, which is actually a developer of exploits and spyware it sells to various government entities or one of its customers. Now, how bad is the exploit? Well, it actually requires little to no customization to actually fully root a vulnerable device. Now, it can be exploited in a couple of ways. Now, one, when a victim actually installs a vulnerable app, that's the normal way normally. Number 2, an online attacker can actually target a vulnerability in the Chrome browser during the render process of a website content. Now, it's actually scary how easy that exploit is. According to researchers, they quote, "The bug is a local privilege escalation vulnerability that allows for full compromise of a vulnerable device if the exploit is delivered via the web. It only needs to be paired with a render exploit, as this vulnerability is accessible through the sandbox, actually breaks through." Now, to help you and your organization out, let's go through a couple of the vulnerable devices, starting out with the Pixel 1 and 2, including the XLs, Huawei P20, the Redmi 5 and 5 Note, the Oppo A3, Moto Zaire, and the Samsung S7, S8, and S9. Now, you can also check out the show notes for the link for the more complete list. But the good thing here is some of the companies are actually working on a patch, and it sounds like the Pixels devices will receive the update in the October security release of Android. Now, the use after free vulnerability originally appeared in the Linux kernel and was patched in the early 2018s in version 4.14 without the benefit of a tracking CVE. Now, that fix was actually incorporated into versions 3.18, 4.4, and 4.9 of the Android kernel. Now, we can't use our normal line of update to tell you to go update, but we can say that you should just make sure you continue to keep an eye out and update as soon as your devices have a patch. Well, folks, that does it for the blips. Next up, we have the bites, but before we get there, we have to thank a really great sponsor of This Week in Enterprise Tech. And this week, it's thanks to Canary. Now, we all know that hackers, they try that path of least resistance. And I always say your organization is only as secure as your weakest link. Well, guess what? What's your weakest link? Well, your users, of course. Now, organizations have to start with that assume breach mindset, because on average, it takes about 191 days for a company to realize that there's been a data breach. Now, you and I know and hear about breaches every day, and they're actually trending upwards. Their companies spend millions of dollars on IT security, but still don't know when they're being compromised. Yikes. Take Marriott Hotels. Now, 500 million guests were affected by their breach over a 4-year period. Now, that's where Thinks Canary steps in. These honeypot appliances are super awesome. Sprinkle a couple of those devices on your network, and when there's a breach, you're alerted immediately. Now, remember, back in the 2000s, people talked about using honeypots, but they weren't easy to deploy. They weren't easy to use. Canary has made this simple with zero administration and managing overhead. Canaries can be set up in under 4 minutes within minutes of configuration, they start working. Canary will look identical to a router, a switch, a NAS server, a Linux box, or even a Windows server. Attackers can't tell the difference. Now, the company behind Canaries has been fighting back in the security game for over 2 decades. They've been training companies, militaries, and governments on how to break into networks, and they've used that experience to actually build Canary and these devices. Now, you might think, well, hackers are going to know that these are honeypots. Stay away from them. Not at all. Thinks Canaries don't look vulnerable on your network. They look valuable. You can actually put fake files on them. You can even enroll them in Active Directory. Now, these devices actually have extreme value to fight back against security breaches. Not only are they great value, but they actually are licensed annually. And if they break down during that year, Thinks will also just replace them. Now, since they're priced well, you can start with a few, and then you can just scale them up over time as you see more value there. Now, some of the largest organizations in the world use Canaries on their network. I think it's time you get value too, right? Now, don't end up on this year's list of top 10 data breaches. Visit canary.tools/twit, and for just $7,500 per year, you get 5 Canaries, your own hosted console, upgrades, support, and maintenance for a full year. And we have a special offer for our audience. Use code TWIT and How Did You Hear About Us box to get 10% off for lifetime. Now, we're sure you'll love Thinks Canary, but if you're not happy you can always return your Canaries within 2 months with a money-back guarantee for a full refund. That's canary.tools/twit and enter the code TWIT in the How Do You Hear About Us box. And we thank Thinks Canary for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Well, folks, let's go ahead and jump into the bites. Now, I feel like each and every week, we continue to give you weekly ransomware reports about how companies, especially local governments, are being brought down to their knees due to ransomware. Well, this week, the latest case hits actually much closer to home, and that's in the healthcare industry. Now, 10 hospitals, 3 in Alabama and 7 in Australia, actually have been hit with a paralyzing ransomware attack that are affecting their ability to actually take new patients. Now, DCH Health in Alabama had actually to close down new patients and only take on critical cases that couldn't get to other hospitals. Now, according to their PR, and I quote, "A criminal is limiting our ability to use our computer systems in exchange for an as yet unknown payment. DCH representatives wrote in the release, our hospitals have implemented our emergency procedures to ensure safe and efficient operations in the event technology dependent on our computers is not available. Now, details about the actual strain of malware weren't actually immediately available, but typically the malware encrypts the production and backup hard drives used to store data and run computer systems. Now, victims can only receive the decryption key needed to restore systems after paying that ransom, usually Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. Now, in some cases, it's actually possible to decrypt the data without paying the ransom, but in other cases, it's normally mostly impossible. Now, there's no immediate indication that the attacks in Alabama and Australia were related, but one of the most memorable times hospitals were widely reported to have hamstrung by ransomware attacks was in the wake of the WannaCry ransomware outbreak in May 2017. To the lesser extent, the NotPetya attack that followed 2 months later. Now, let's try to get, I want to get to the root of this, guys. I just don't understand. Cheebert, I want to start with you. Why does this keep happening? Why do we keep hearing organizations, local governments, and now hospitals, which are actually a big thing? I mean, they affect the community, they affect people, they affect the health and the survival of people. Why does this keep happening to organizations like that?
I don't know. I think it's just the bottom line. We're seeing a huge shortage of cybersecurity specialists. And face it, any organization I've ever dealt with, the cybersecurity group has always been tiny, and it's a big job. And the problem is they're also not really that, they are not able to drive policy. So I've seen time and time again, I see a lot of different organizations where employees mix personal data with the sensitive data. There's not a whole lot of compartmentalization. I know it sounds like a lot of work to do, but we really need to start educating our users. We need to have cybersecurity specialists getting into the everyday operation of organizations to start educating the users to change the way they do things. Malware doesn't come in out of the blue. It's not, read my mind and get my password. Someone did some social engineering. Someone clicked on a link. It's not going to happen just out of the blue. And we need more people. So like, for instance, at my lab, I literally created this lab so that we can upscale students' skills, get them experience with the latest and greatest in the networking industry. I did this kind of sneakily. I said, hey, if I can graduate a lot more kids that have the right skills, then maybe, just maybe, the cost to hire these students will go down. And once it goes down, then more of the students will be hired. So while it sounds counterproductive for the students, I feel it was better for the economy because we needed higher skilled networking specialists. I think we need to start doing the same thing for cybersecurity. What do you think, Lou?
Yeah, I like that. Start them young, get them into the field of and the understanding of that field, and then when they get into market, they're ready to go. This actually is interesting. Google even has this philosophy, right? They've been trying to get their Chromebooks and their technology and their services and Sheets and Docs and all that stuff into education for a long time, because you start them out young, you get them in there. They get familiar with it, and when they go into their companies, their startups, their corporations, they bring that with them, right? And I think that's the best way to especially get the next generation going. Curtis, I want to throw this to you, because the interesting thing here is this is a hospital. Like, how does a hospital, or how do hospitals, multiple hospitals, get into this problem without backups? Like, I thought maybe something like HIPAA have some rules around this, don't they?
Well, no, HIPAA has rules around disclosure of patient data. It's all about privacy. Now, there are some federal rules that might come into play. The set of rules that has resulted in EHR, or electronic health records, being required of essentially every healthcare organization that accepts Medicaid or Medicare payment, and those that don't are required to by the insurance companies they work with. The problem really is, as Chee pointed out, economic. The organizations that are being hit, at least in the U.S., are quite small. I mean, if you look at the 3 hospitals in Alabama, I know where 2 of those are. The Tuscaloosa, of course, that's the university town that houses University of Alabama. The other big employer there is a Mercedes-Benz car assembly plant, but it's not a very large town. I would be surprised if the population of the city of Tuscaloosa was 100,000. Northport is an even smaller town north of Tuscaloosa. Fayette's going to be even smaller than that. So what you had here were 3 medical centers. Almost certainly they shared virtually all of their back-end data processing, probably had a small staff. And this is, by the way, pure speculation. I don't have any inside information on this, but I suspect that what happened was that some user clicked on the wrong attachment in a file. The malware got in, began lateral infection, and there you are. Should backups take care of this? Oh, you bet they should. But still, far too few organizations in the small to mid-size enterprise space have reliable, best practices oriented backup and recovery schemes. The fact is, they're not horrifically expensive to put in place, especially compared to what it costs to recover from something like one of these ransomware attacks.
Right. You bring up a good point. We talked about it in the past about people getting ransomware insurance. And sometimes, we talked about getting backups. And then I want to throw this last question to Chee, because you brought up a point about, hey, backups are easy. Why don't you just back up, and then you'll be able to recover pretty easily from that. But in some cases, like healthcare data, there could be a lot of data, right? And there could be a large cost to actually backing up that data, which means it might actually be cheaper for them to pay the 10,000 Bitcoin or $10,000 worth of Bitcoin rather than spend $150,000 or $200,000 on a backup service. So, Chee, I want to throw this to you. How do you educate organizations on, you talked a little bit about how we educate the next generation on IT processes and backing up and doing the right thing, but how do we get current organizations to do this? What are they supposed to do to educate the current in-market force?
There's obviously no one answer. It's a lot of it is you just gotta, it's like eating an elephant, one bite at a time. It's a really old joke, but it applies. And, I like to equate it to the early 1950s, maybe the late 1940s. After World War II, and there is a huge building boom, not only just in America, but also rebuilding, Japan rebuilding, the Germany and so forth. It created a huge need for engineers. And maybe I'm pulling at straws here. Maybe this is equivalent. We need to go and see the need. Management, the people with the money need to see the need for cybersecurity specialists. But I personally think cybersecurity specialists, there's going to be the really talented ones, and those are going to be the specialists. But I think cybersecurity actually has to be brought in to every walk of education. And while Google's been doing a fairly good job with, getting Chromebooks and so forth, I've got to go and toot Microsoft's horn, because the Microsoft Developers Network Academic Alliance, all makes it a lot. And I'm actually not even sure what it's called now, but Microsoft has made it very, very cheap for students to be able to go and get educated on Microsoft tools and products. And they've got, obviously it's affecting the bottom line because, students, aren't buying certain things, but students usually aren't going to be able to afford to buy, visuals, the full end Visual Studio or Visual Team Studio. But it certainly has made a difference in the type of software they're developing. Maybe corporations, be it Microsoft, be it Google or so forth, maybe the cybersecurity tools need to be treated the same way. We need to get the students used to using them so that we can start closing down these loopholes. A lot of these vulnerabilities we keep talking about over and over and over and over again are old vulnerabilities. We need to have the tools be inexpensive enough so that even really small organizations can go and try and find them. Maybe, just maybe, we're making it too expensive by making it too specialized.
Makes sense. You speak the truth. Thanks, Cheebert. Well, I do want to go jump into our next bite because with that latest iOS jailbreak, what actually brings up the interesting question about firmware security. Now, Curt, your bite brings up a good set of questions about FISMA requirements around firmware security.
Absolutely, Lou. Adversaries, the bad guys, and we'll be fair, bad ladies as well, have recently noticed that firmware and hardware constitute a serious blind spot for most organizations. While firmware might have once been the domain of nation-state attackers, it's now easier than ever for criminals to develop firmware-based attacks that bypass security, cause serious and sometimes permanent damage. While advances in firmware security mean that organizations no longer need specialized talent or manual analysis to protect their firmware, a non-trivial risk remains. So enter the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA. Let's be clear here. FISMA applies almost solely to government agencies and the companies doing business with the government, and yet it's based on NIST standards that provide guidance on best practices for any organization. Its guidance on firmware is worth the attention of both governments and non-governmental security and risk management teams. So, first, firmware clearly falls well within the scope for FISMA compliance. Regulations requirements are spelled out in two NIST documents, SP 800-37, which lays out a risk management framework, and SP 800-53, which addresses security and privacy controls. Both of these identify firmware as a critical part of a security program. Now, the first phase of the risk management framework, or RMF, that's defined under FISMA, calls on organizations to define their high-level risk strategy based on whatever their unique mission is, along with their tolerance for risk, what kind of threats they may face, and other factors. This is going to require an understanding of both the scope and severity of the threats that an organization faces, and that includes the threats to firmware. Firmware is the foundational code of a device. You see it in places like BIOS or UEFI, where they run before the operating system ever boots. It's also present in virtually every piece of hardware in a computer system, from storage to network adapters. There are plenty of opportunities for an attacker to come in and snoop through firmware. Now, many of the controls specifically called out in FISMA affect firmware security. As an example, configuration management states the importance of only using updates that are cryptographically signed. Another control, SI7, or System and Information Integrity, also addresses firmware along with software and information integrity. Firmware is explicitly within the scope of FISMA, and because of ongoing efforts across the industry, the cost of including firmware protections into a security program are now lower than ever. With open source and commercial tools available, organizations can now deploy firmware security at scale in the supply chain, in their operations, and in incident response. Armed with an understanding of the severity and scope of the firmware threat, organizations can determine the proper controls required to comply with FISMA and, perhaps more important, strengthen their firmware security in a noticeable, practical way. Now, I want to bring in both my co-hosts, and Chee, we're going to start with you because I know you have labored in the groves of government. So from what you have seen, how useful is FISMA really for the private sector?
Well, I equate FISMA with, the benefits of NASA. It sounds like a heck of a stretch, but remember, a heck of a lot of technology, not the least of which is Velcro, originally came about from the space agency. So by using public money to develop and solve problems, we then spun off a lot of technology. In fact, NASA actually publishes an annual magazine called Spin-Offs. And it talks about all the different NASA technology that's spun off into the private sector, sometimes with license fees, sometimes without, depending on where the development money came from. I think FISMA is going to be similar. I've been saying about NISPOM Chapter 8, which is for Department of Defense, classified work. But FISMA is for regular federal agencies. And I think having some standards that can be followed, things like ISO 9001 started with the government, but now we use ISO 9001 or similar for commercial data systems, computer data centers, and so forth. So having some standards that are hopefully easy to understand, easy to implement, and corporations, vendors have the experience making their devices FISMA compliant is a pretty good thing. In fact, a lot of firewalls I work with, the Sonic walls, there's actually a check mark, a radio button that will slam down federal information system standards with one click. So that's kind of cool. So I think we're going to see a lot of trickle down. We're going to see a lot of spin-offs. I think we just need to get a little more organized, and the private sector needs to understand and realize, maybe the federal government, for the most part, does know what they're doing, and hopefully continues to do, though.
Well, I think we would all like to think that, and I agree with you. I certainly hope that's the case because of not only the importance of what they do with the government, but the number of private enterprises that look to FISMA for best practices for their own operations. Lou, speaking of those best practices, FISMA deals with more than just the firmware. There's also software, and I know that with your work, you look at security of software. How different is protection of software and firmware, and is there a way to link the two, or do they need to remain entirely separate concepts?
I mean, if you want the most security, like for instance, UEFI secure boot, that happens it's still software related, but it's at the hardware layer. So it's really kind of designed to protect systems from, running malicious code before they even boot. And so these types of things are, they prevent bootkits from being installed and that kind of thing. But again, there's software that kind of works together with the hardware, and it's at the hardware layer that it's loaded. So I think that they kind of have to work together. Now, there's a lot of other things like, you have everything from USB keyboards to webcams to graphics cards to sound cards, whatever, even batteries somehow firmware on them. And so you have to be, hey, some of these don't even have software, or maybe they do, but it's very minimal. And so we need to find ways to secure these things. And I really think, there has to be some kind of standard, like you guys have been saying, that comes up and says, if you're going to have this type of controller and this type of firmware on it, then you have to have some kind of software-related system that also prevents, accessing and loading and overloading these types of things. And I mean, we've just been hearing about these jailbreaks that come out from iOS that are now impossible to prevent, because unless they put out a firmware update to the iOS device to fix it. And so, there's really no way to get around these types of things unless you start handling it from a software perspective. So I really hope that will change in the near future. Well, folks, that does it for this bite. Next up, we get to really my favorite part of the show, actually, where we get to bring in a guest to drop some knowledge on the Twilight Riot. But before we do, we have to thank another great sponsor of This Week in Enterprise Tech, and that is Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage. Now, I've used Wasabi before, and they are awesome. You might be thinking, well, I've used cloud storage before, and the more I store in it, or the more I access the data, and the more operations I perform on it, the more I get charged. Well, in this day and age, that's pretty much the story for most of the cloud storage companies out there. Now, most cloud storage providers, they're really just competing nowadays to see how low they can go on their storage fees and their ingress and egress fees. Well, Wasabi has a solution for you here. Now, from experience, I can tell you that if you try to go cheaper on some cloud storage systems, you also give up the performance and reliability as well. Well, Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage has a way to fix all of these things. From small personal projects all the way up to large enterprise projects, Wasabi has figured it all out. Let's start with the cost. Listen to this. Pricing is $5.99 per terabyte per month. That is super competitive in this landscape. Now, plus, listen to the game changer. Unlimited free egress for your data. No charge for API calls, so you don't actually have to pay to access your data. Now, check out what you're already paying for cloud storage, because I can tell you that not having to include egress fees and API calls will substantially save you money in the long term, for sure. For sure. Now, you're probably thinking, well, if they're cheaper, they must be slower. They don't have the bells and whistles. Well, Wasabi, they are able to tackle all these areas. They have developed a disruptive technology. They found ways to pull raw performance out of the storage devices without compromising anything. They have a revolutionary process that lays down data on disk sequentially as opposed to blocks. And what happens when that happens? Well, that means that Wasabi's storage is 80% cheaper and 6 times faster in speed than the industry leaders. Now, if your organization's also worried about compliance, well, Wasabi has you covered there as well. HIPAA, FINRA, and CJS compliant, no problem. You definitely can actually support you there. Now, fast, cheap storage isn't worth much if your data isn't secured, right? Well, Wasabi also has an answer. They offer a unique feature of immutable buckets that cannot be deleted or altered, protecting your valuable data from accidental or malicious destruction. Now, see if you can find another service that's actually doing that today. Plus, an 11 nines of durability. That's pretty hard to do from a cloud service today. Now, moving your on-premise IT setup to cloud solutions is one of the most critical business decisions your company will make. So according to industry-leading market research firm Gartner, by 2025, 80% of enterprises will have shut down their traditional data center versus 10% today. Now, Wasabi is going to help ease that transition and have you feel confident in the move to the cloud. Data storage is all that Wasabi does. They are experts. It's their passion. They believe that in a world of rapidly escalating cloud storage needs, that progress depends on cloud storage being more like a utility with fast, affordable storage available in endless supply. Now, I bet you want to try this out right now, right? Well, go build something fun and move your data right now. They truly understand the needs of the enterprises, so they don't have things like egress fees. Now, calculate savings for yourself and start a free trial of unlimited storage for a month. Go to wasabi.com, click the free trial link, and enter the code ENTERPRISE. Join the movement and migrate your data to the cloud with confidence. Go to wasabi.com and make sure to use the offer code ENTERPRISE. And we thank Wasabi for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Well, folks, it's my favorite part of the show. We get to bring a guest in to drop some knowledge on the Twilight Riot. And today is no exception. We have Mr. Kyle Davis, Head of Developer Advocacy of Redis Labs. Welcome to the show, Kyle.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, our audience loves to hear origin stories. Can you maybe take us through a journey through tech and how you ended up at Redis Labs?
Yeah, sure thing. It's funny. I had a misspent youth in software development. I was remember like 8 years old, learning how to write a compiler, and like that was my passion when I was a kid. And I went to university at a very bad time because I went to university right before the .com bubble and thought I would like come into tech and everything would be amazing, right? And while I was in university, that all changed, right? And so I kind of had an interesting route. I went through some time where I worked in higher education with students, and tech was always in my kind of secondary kind of thing I did when I went home, and it was my passion. And then I kind of went out of that and went back into tech in general. I had worked at a few different consulting providers and a few other things. And then I went out on my own to develop kind of some bespoke stuff. And I had this really weird project that I needed this like really fast response time on some stuff. This is about 2012. And I couldn't get it out of the databases that I had. I was like looking for stuff constantly. And I realized I had, a gigabyte of data. And to run the queries I needed, the database I was using was taking a gigabyte just to run the query, and this is crazy. And so I thought I'm going to write my own database, and thankfully that was something I didn't follow through on because that's a mammoth undertaking. But I said I need to do something in memory, and I found this thing called Redis. And I started working on it and writing some software with it, and then I realized people had really tried to develop stuff with it, but they didn't know how, right? Like people were really struggling on Stack Overflow and all that stuff. So I started blogging about it. And then this company called Redis Labs found my blog and they said, hey, this is great. After that, they started to say, hey, why don't you write some stuff for us? I wrote some things for them, and I went to users conference, and they said, hey, they were still a very small company when I joined, and they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I really want to work with developers. And that brings us to about now. I've been with the company for a few years, and the company's just, really growing. I feel almost like a parent. I've seen it like grow from this tiny nucleus of a company up to this pretty large organization. So that's how I got to Redis Labs.
Fantastic. Now, developer experience is near and dear to my heart, so I definitely want to get to some of that stuff that you're working on there. But before we get to that, I want to maybe help the audience. Some people might not know. Obviously, Redis has been around for a while, and they do great things. But maybe you can help the audience understand what is Redis. What are some of the major use cases for it?
Sure thing. So Redis is an in-memory database, right? It is an in-memory NoSQL database. It kind of works unlike a lot of databases in the world in that you don't supply it with a SQL query. You supply it with a command and a identifier for that, and then it provides you the data back. But at its heart, it also provides a structure to it. And so I like to think about it as a database that also works like a developer thinks, right? So we have kind of the fundamental primitives that you would use in your application. We have like linked lists and hash maps and bit fields and some of these other kind of fundamental data structures that you would use to kind of construct an application. Now, if you're using a lot of other databases, effectively you're going to like start marshaling things in and out of those type of pieces of structure. So you're going to throw it into a SQL table, then pull it back out and do something with it. This kind of short circuits all that. So it provides a layer where you can store that on a remote server. Redis stands for Remote Dictionary Server, which is a little bit of a apocryphal story, but I'll get to that maybe later. But it basically provides that where you can throw it up into a cluster and be able to retrieve it later. So it really provides a completely different experience for the database world. And you can really rapidly build applications with it that are really high performance.
Now, I've worked on numerous services in the past, similar to Redis, and I'm always curious about the technology. In fact, little known fact, one of my many areas that I own here at Microsoft is I actually own the Access client, and that is still live and kicking. People still use applications on it, still build databases on it. But on that note, what is the kind of tech that Redis is built on?
Yeah, so Redis is used in a lot of times where you want to have like the highest performance possible, right? Like that's what it's designed for. The reason it can achieve that is it's written entirely in C, and it's which is, C is a great language. And for a lot of my career, I actually stayed away from writing programs in C, and it's not something you do lightly, right? It's kind of the minimal abstraction that you would have from assembly language. But so it's written in C, which provides this kind of really direct access to memory. And then if you're using a scripting language, for example, that would have all sorts of different type of memory allocations and garbage collection and all these things that kind of get in the way, you can kind of take advantage of that low-level memory access and all the other things that come along with it. So not only would it provide you with the memory access, but you can also like persist to disk. So you have kind of the best of both worlds there. So yeah, it's great when I look at it because it very much is an example of doing nothing really exotic, but doing everything very well. So it's all just really well written C code. And I often tell people who come to my workshops and things like that when I'm talking about Redis, like if you want to see what good C source code looks like, go and take a look at the open source, right? It's all available, and it's like you could see some pretty gnarly C across the web, but this is an island of serenity, right?
It's true. It's true. So you brought up some interesting things and facts about the type of data types. Obviously, data developers work and think about data types and data abstractions, but this actually supports things even on top of that. Like it even supports geospatial things and other types of data types that actually help. Like for instance, if I wanted to query how close 2 points are, like Redis handles that as well, correct?
Sure thing. Yeah, so Redis is actually designed as kind of an extensible database. So there's a number of built-in data structures. I mentioned some of them, but we also have geospatial querying and this kind of sorted set data type, which allows for sets with a kind of native sort order. So there's a lot of different pieces in there that are kind of more advanced than what people might think of as just kind of a primitive data structure. But on top of that, what it does is it provides a way for you to write your own data structures as well. So if you are so inclined, you can use a systems programming language to implement kind of whatever you want. We have people who use it, for example, for a search engine or a graph database. And these are like plugins that go right into the heart of the database and allow you to, use all the great operational characteristics that have kind of evolved over 10 years, and then do something custom with that. So it's really allowing you to have like your cake and eat it too when it comes to, giving you the flexibility of having a lot of different data types. At the same time, being able to not have to recreate the world or recreate the wheel every time for all the stuff that you would have to operate a database. So, for example, like high availability and some of the operational characteristics.
Makes sense. Now, from an enterprise perspective, I do want to get to that side of things.
Sure.
Is there enterprise-related features here? Like, for instance, does it do failover? Is there transactional support, data consistency, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. And there's Redis open source and there's Redis enterprise, and you might have guessed by the name, the enterprise version is made for enterprise. The open source version certainly is a really capable database, but what enterprise does is kind of takes that open source core and surrounds it with a lot of features that enterprise really requires. So it provides it with primarily in the operational area where it comes to things like high availability, advanced clustering, failover, the whole gamut of things that enterprise would really require, whereas a small startup might just need kind of the bare minimum to get going, and open source provides that like in spades. But when you look at what enterprise provides, it provides like what a large organization or maybe a small organization that needs uses Redis very extensively would require, right? So it really is enterprise grade and ready to go. And it's kind of amazing what you can do. You look at you can do a lot with the open source, and then you can see how some amazingly large some of the deployments of Redis Enterprise are. And it's kind of I thought I was before I joined the company, I had like 10 gigabytes in Redis, and I thought I was had a lot of data in there, and I was running a small cluster, and then I joined the company, and I thought, ooh, I'm kind of small here.
I totally get that. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Redis and scalable databases. But before we do have to thank another great sponsor of This Week in Enterprise Tech, and that is WWT, or Worldwide Technology. Now, if you've gotten a chance to visit the Worldwide Technology Advanced Technology Center, you should really go, because it is one of the most amazing things you can possibly see. They've been building this thing for over 10 years, and it has grown exponentially. It really is like no other testing and research lab you've ever seen. Now, listen to what the lab contains. More than $500 million in equipment from hundreds of OEMs, ranging from heavyweights like Cisco, NetApp, VMware, to the actually emerging disruptors like Titanium, Equinix, and Expanse. Now, when you're developing products, you want to work with an organization you can trust, right? Well, WWT is that trusted partner. They'll stay with you over the years. In fact, many of the customers that have been with them for over a decade, because they know that WWT is where they can go to get the answers they need to make sure their business runs right. Now, with all that it has to offer, the ATC really is an incubator. The incubator for IT innovation. Listen to what else it has to offer. On-demand schedulable labs like Cisco ACI, segmentation migration, and hundreds of other labs representing the newest advances in endpoint security architecture, software-defined networking, network automation, primary and secondary storage. Now, you may have worked on large products before, right? Well, sometimes you want to try building products before you know about what the industry has to offer to help. Well, the ATC can help you learn about products before you launch. The WWT's engineers use these environments to quickly spin up proof of concepts and pilots using sandboxes so customers can confidently select the best solution. Now, in many cases, this actually reduces your time to market from months to weeks and actually increases your speed of innovation. Now, they offer a lab as a service. It's a dedicated lab space within the ATC. Now, here customers can actually perform programmatic testing using vast technology ecosystem that WWT has already built. Now, it's virtual, so you can actually take advantage of the ATC unique benefit anywhere in the world 24/7. Now, WWT's engineers work in these labs every day. They're beta testing new equipment. They're building reference architectures and custom integrations to help their customers make decisions and see results faster with much less investment. Now, if you have been eagerly awaiting to actually get to market faster, the time is finally here. WWT has launched their new digital platform encompassing the ATC ecosystem. Now, this ecosystem creates a multiplier effect of knowledge, speed, and agility anywhere around the world from their customers. Get access to articles, case studies, hands-on labs, and other tools that make difference in today's fast-paced world. To learn more about WWT, the ATC, and sign up for access to their new on-demand lab platform, go to wwt.com/twit and create an account today. WWT simplifies the complex. That website is wwt.com/twit. WWT, delivering business and technology outcomes around the world. And we thank Worldwide Technologies for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Well, folks, let's go back and jump into it. We're talking with Kyle Davis from Redis Labs. Kyle, thank you so much for being here. We really love talking about new technology and ways for enterprises to adopt it. I want to throw one more question to you about kind of how enterprises and people are using these things. Obviously, a lot of projects today are already built, whether it's ASP.NET Core applications, Node applications. How can they integrate Redis into their application core that they already have?
Yeah, Redis is really widely distributed among different types of applications. We have 62 different client libraries. So, pretty much any language that you're looking to build an application in, it's easy to integrate Redis with that. There's higher level things as well. So, for example, like with a .NET application, there's the ability to use it as a session store. And that's basically a plug and play. You point it at a Redis server, and then that Redis server can then, take advantage of that. So it persists your sessions for you. And it's kind of hands off, right? Like you have your infrastructure there, and you pointed at that, and now you have sessions. But it can be used really widely as well for caching use cases as well. So there's frameworks that just build Redis caching into it, so you don't have to make so many calls out to your database. And indeed, as well, there's people have built custom bespoke applications that use Redis as just their primary database. So there's nothing else there. It's just Redis and maybe a disaster recovery system that they're using just in case the data center burns down.
Fantastic. Well, you want to bring my co-host back in because they have some really great questions, starting with Curtis. Because Curtis, I want you to put maybe the enterprise spin on it.
One of my questions, whenever we deal with anything based off of an open source project, is how it compares to some of the more thoroughly commercial offerings. So I was wondering if you might be able to compare what you have to something like an SAP HANA. Are you going to have some of the same use cases, SAP S4 aside? Is it the same sort of use case and benefit analysis for both products?
Sure. And Redis is used in this wide range of different applications. We see people using it from financial services and critical, payment infrastructures. So, it's used amazingly there. And then it's also used in things for like analytic use cases as well. So it really is kind of this jack of all trades that exists in so many different stacks. So you'll see it from the largest enterprises down to the smallest, little startups that are using it to kind of accelerate data, and as well in critical parts of the infrastructure, whether that might be in the middle of, like I said, financial services. It might be in fraud mitigation, which is used quite frequently for fraud mitigation use cases. It's the kind of first line of defense as a identifying fraud as it comes in real time. Right. And that's one of the places where you really see Redis being used is anytime you require an extremely low latency. And, we kind of have this ethos inside the company that if you can't do it quickly, it's not worth doing. So that's where we kind of see our place being, whether it be in any level of different type of application. If you need to do it quickly, Redis is kind of synonymous with that type of use.
Okay, well, so I get the rapid nature. I think of any in-memory system, you're hoping for that. But let me ask then a question about the platform that it's got to sit on, because sure. I know, when I've seen other in-memory things. Now I'll go back because I've been following HANA for a long time. When they were originally demoing that, they were doing it on a Mac Pro, the little square hockey puck, and
sure.
showing that it could run on that. But we all know that if you really want to use it in an enterprise situation, you need a server that has a whole bunch of zeros in the price tag. And how is Redis compared to that? I mean, how resource hungry is it? Obviously, the more memory you can throw at it, the better. But does it require, a monster hardware platform to be effective, or can as you say, an organization with perhaps more limited resources still get useful conditions and useful deployment out of Redis?
Oh, for sure. So the open source has about 6.5 megabytes of overhead. So if you throw it on a server, that's all it's going to take to use. So really very small. The enterprise has a lot more features added onto it, so it has a larger overhead because it's providing a lot more operational characteristics to it that require more memory. But still, it's very, very lightweight in comparison to other database systems. And honestly, one of my first grasp for it was basically because it was so lightweight. In fact, it can be deployed, the clients can be deployed directly onto IoT devices with as little as 64 kilobytes of RAM. So it can get really lightweight. And everything we've done about it is trying to optimize to make sure that we are very resourceful with the bits, not the bytes, the bits. So as an example, it's one of the internal parts of Redis that identifies where commands are. We use 6-bit characters because 7 or 8 bits is too much. So we're really, really, counting pennies in the development of it to make sure it does have that kind of optimal use case. At the same time, we're seeing people use it for storing terabytes of data that it's practically the same source code that's also being used in a small blog to cache 50 megabytes of data, right? So it really has that huge range that can go from very small to very large. And the key to it is just the whole performance, right? Any way you look at it, we don't think that even if you want to have all the operational characteristics that enterprise provides, you should be able to achieve the very small footprint and the high speed that you would get out of an open source instance. So we try to optimize for performance, no matter the size of the database, right?
All right. And one last question on deployment. It sounds like you can be pretty efficient, but so many companies of various sizes are moving to the cloud. How is Redis as something that's deployed via the cloud? Is this being done? And how complex is it? Or, is it something you even recommend?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Actually, most of our deployments are on one of the major clouds. So, our probably largest area that people are deploying us is in on AWS. But the nice thing about it is that it's just as home on-prem as it is in the cloud. And in fact, it can be hybrid or multi-cloud deployments as well. It has quite a few things in it. It's from a company standpoint, we try to be cloud agnostic, right? Because we think the cloud is a great solution for modern problems, in a great way to build applications. So we really kind of focus on that. In fact, we have native Kubernetes support in our enterprise product, which really allows for you to really take it up to the most modern deployment methodologies in the cloud or on-prem in that matter. But the really cool thing, I think, we have this ability to take it to multiple different places on the cloud. So one of the features we have is called active-active, and basically that allows you to have multiple clusters that are synchronized together. And those clusters automatically resolve conflicts when they might occur. So it's really capable of doing geo-local distributions of Redis. So you could have an East Coast and a West Coast cluster that are both actively being written to, and then the clusters themselves on the database level is resolving all of the problems that might occur when two different people try to write to the same piece of data. And so it uses a technology called conflict-free replicated data types that are based out of academic research out of a university in Portugal. And these are mathematically proven as the best way to ensure that you're not going to lose data when you have two different locations of your data, and they could be both written at the same time. And that's a really vexing problem for a lot of databases to resolve, because they try to lock things across geographies, and you have just the speed of light is too far to lock for whatever it is between East and West Coast, 91 milliseconds or whatever. That's far too slow. So when you have it deployed in the cloud, you can continue to grow, and you can continue to scale it out as you go along. So it's really easy to deploy in the cloud. It's basically is kind of pointed at a cloud instance, and you can deploy it either as a software that you manage yourself, or there's the company also provides a managed service where it operates and we kind of make a link in the VPC, so it operates as if it's in your cloud, but we're managing it for you. So we have a whole range of solutions as far as deploying that. It depends on whether you want to manage yourself or you want to have other people manage it.
So Kyle, I'm going to ask the other end of the spectrum. I do a lot of field ecology, field science, where we're using relatively small computers like Raspberry Pis or BeagleBones and things like that. We have in the past used a lot of real-time operating systems like VxWorks so that we could deal with very high frequency data. So say, for instance, we're monitoring power line quality for solar inverters. We need to pull down 1 second or even microsecond data to be able to go and catch those waveforms. Now, the problem is databases are always a problem. VxWorks has a few things, but it's cumbersome. How would Redis work in such an environment?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's actually one of my kind of personal projects with Redis. I'm actually interested in IoT work. Redis does work on basically a Unix-based operating system. So when you get into some of the real-time operating systems, they don't necessarily have all the kind of setup for a Unix-based Berkeley sockets type of application to be used. Now, on the other end, when you do have a Linux distribution, we do have a build for ARM, and we even have some distributions for edge type of topologies. So with Redis's performance is concerned, we can get down to response times in the milliseconds is like totally doable, right? Microseconds is another thing, but if you're writing a collection of microsecond-based samples into, for example, a time series, that's totally possible to be done. And it's really great when you look at something like a Raspberry Pi, because they do have constrained environments and they do have these constrained resources. And Redis can run in a constrained resource very easily. When I said 6 megabytes of overhead, when you're talking about a Raspberry Pi that may have 512 megabytes of RAM, you're still on an operating system, and whatever's collecting the data, you still have time to actually collect and put data on it, and still have the RAM room in the RAM for that. In addition, it's possible to have a single instance of Redis go for 30,000 operations per second. And when you get into the clusters, they run into benchmarks as they might be, but 200 million operations per second is possible across a cluster, right? Now, real world data, that's going to probably be different, because you're probably going to do something more sophisticated than what a benchmark would do. But it's totally possible. And what's really nice about it is that you could do it locally, and then you can actually have it connect up to you can have that local latency, and then you can have it actually then synchronize with something in a larger system on a base server. So even if you have intermittent connections, that's totally possible to actually resolve that data.
We've been talking with Kyle Davis from Redis. Kyle, thank you so much for being here. We're running a little bit low on time. We do want to give you a chance to maybe tell the folks at home, tell the organizations where they can go, where they can get started, where they can get their projects kind of experimenting on Redis, maybe even get integrated with Redis.
Sure. So there's 2 places to go. The first place to go is redislabs.com. That's our website. That'll give you, we have a blog there, a tech blog, which will probably be of interest to the viewers here, that really it kind of goes through and allows you to take a look at all what's going on brand new. Then you can take a look also at redis.io, which is our open source website. The open source website has a great resource as far as the commands and all the resources you really need to know to learn it. And the other place I would go on redislabs.com, there is a what's called Redis University, and this is a series of courses that actually allow you to do kind of self-paced instruction. I'm actually an instructor for one of those. So the Redis Search course, which is our search engine, you can watch me for 18 hours. So they're video instructed courses that have kind of week by week homework and goals that you reach. It's really a great course. All the courses are really good, but because I hosted this one, I'm kind of partial to this one.
Fantastic. Well, folks, you've done it again. You've sat through another hour of the best dang enterprise podcast, according to 9 out of 10 NoSQL shards. But I want to thank everyone who makes this show possible, especially to our co-host in crime, starting with our very own Mr. Curtis Franklin. Curtis, always great to have you here, sir. Where can the folks find you, all of your ventures, and your writing?
Well, as always, people who are looking for me can find me at Dark Reading, especially in the section we like to call The Edge. I'm doing some deeper features, some more involved things, some, I hope, more interesting things. So come on by, check it out. I've got something going up on best practices for protecting Active Directory. I had something this last week on a new program in the city of Los Angeles where they're offering free cybersecurity aid to small and medium-sized businesses. So lots of interesting stuff happening, lots coming up, and I'd love to have your thoughts. Drop me a line, a direct message at Twitter at KG4GWA or on Instagram over at Curt_Franklin.
Thanks, Curtis. Well, another one of my favorite people and our geek in paradise, Mr. Brian Chee. Cheebert, where can the folks find you and all of your work?
Well, I am ADVNETLAB, Advanced Net Lab on Twitter. You're also welcome to drop me a line using email. I am Cheebert at twit.tv, but why don't you drop it line to Twyet at twit.tv, and that'll hit all the hosts. And you know what? I've already gone to redis.io and bookmarked that page because I'm going to start reading because, this might solve some of my problems with power line monitoring.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cheebert. Well, we also have to thank you as well. You're that person who drops in each and every week to watch and listen to get your enterprise goodness, and we want to make it easy for you to watch and listen to the show and get your enterprise news. Go to our show page right now, twit.tv/Twyat. There you'll find all of the amazing back episodes, plus all the show notes, co-host information, guest information, and links to the stories that we do during the show. But more importantly, next to those videos, you'll get those helpful subscribe links and your download links to support the audio version of your choice, the video version of your choice on any one of your devices. It's really the best way to stay on top of your enterprise and IT news. You might as well go ahead and subscribe. You can use any one of your local podcast apps that you use today. Now, after you subscribe, you might as well share the show with your friends, your family, your coworkers. We love doing the show. And if you subscribe or continue to subscribe, we can continue to actually do the show. Now, after you subscribe, also remember we do this show live each and every week. That's at live.twit.tv. That's at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time on Fridays. Come see how the show's run, see the behind the scenes, see how we set up the show, all that stuff. And if you want to join the show live, you might as well jump into the chat room live as well. There's a lot of great characters in the chat room right now, giving us a bunch of great questions and actually helping us shape the show as we move along. But if you can't jump in live, you can't watch live, you can't jump in live, don't forget we have a really great new community out there as well that we started. It's twit.community. It's a new forum. Actually lets you check out all the latest hosts, shows, information. The Twin Army's on there. They have great topics. They're talking about each show. Every show is going to have their own topic on there that you can talk about. Obviously, there's every one of the hosts is going to be on there. They're going to talk about different topics. You can ask questions. It's really the way to handle these things off-peak times that you're not on the live stream, you're not on the live chat. It's a way to catch up and really stay connected with the Twit community. Don't forget to check that out, twit.community. Now, also, don't forget you can follow me, twitter.com/LouMM. There you'll see all the posts that I do during my week, especially what I do at Microsoft, where you can check out also latest and greatest Office productivity by extending Office at dev.office.com, where we post all the latest and greatest ways to customize Office and extend it for your organization. Now, I also want to thank everyone who makes the show possible, because they're really the people that continue to support us each and every week, especially Leo and Lisa. They support us, and they've been supporting us from the beginning of doing, and we couldn't do this in this week in Enterprise Tech without them. So thank you for their support. We also thank all the engineers at Twit, and of course, thank you to Mr. Brian Chee. He's also our tireless producer. He gets all the bookings, the plannings for the show, all the notes. Thank you for him, and without him, we really couldn't do this show. And also we have to thank our TD for today, Mr. Victor. Victor, you got a camera on yourself there?
Kind of. I'm all the way back.
Okay. We have to continue our tradition each and every week, right? We want to make sure you're paying attention. Did you, maybe you can tell us what the main topic of the show today was, the theme?
Well, one of them, I have two. One of them is Cheebert is sneaky. And the second one is you got to eat an elephant one bite at a time.
Cheebert is definitely sneaky. I'll give you that one. But, and the elephant thing is, yeah, it's that.
It applies to a lot in life.
That's right. I would say the theme would be to back up, because otherwise your ransomware is going to get you. But I would say you were very close. Maybe next time. But
back up one bite at a time then.
One bite at a time. There you go. Okay, pretty close. Pretty close. Thanks, Victor. Well, until next time, I'm Louis Maresca, just reminding you, if you want to know what's going on in the enterprise, just keep quiet.